spoke to Sean Hannity, everybody refuses to call Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity, nobody calls Sean Hannity. I said the war's a stupid thing, if somebody would call Sean Hannity. I spoke to Sean Hannity, everybody refuses to call Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity, nobody calls Sean Hannity. I said the war's a stupid thing, if somebody would call Sean Hannity. I spoke to Sean Hannity, everybody refuses to call Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity, nobody calls Sean Hannity. I said the war's a stupid thing, if somebody would call Sean Hannity. I spoke to Sean.
And this is the Fourth Branch Project, the first and only program which is dedicated exclusively to those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Welcome to the Fourth Branch program. Glad you can make it. I am MD. This program is dedicated exclusively for those with common sense, a spirit of patriotism, and a determination for a more perfect union. Stay tuned as we begin the discussion of a very important, interesting, and enlightening topic. Hope to hear from you soon. Happy listening. Hello everyone, I am MD and this is the fourth branch program. The level of ignorance of a people is the most accurate gauge to determine the strength of democracy in that country. There is no argument there, and it is not to be debated in regards to what America is going through at this point. We have in the Oval Office the least incompetent president since the creation of the Republic. And the past 2 years, we had a Congress and a Senate, members of which relegated their constitutional duties and had created a crisis in the country. As such, it is really not debatable that the level of ignorance in the Republican Party has reached a degree, a height never seen before. It is called many things. Members of the media call it anger of a very large group. They call it a situation in which constituents in the Republican Party were tired of the same old situation in Washington. And many have debated that's what plunged the country in the predicament it is today. Both the President of the United States and legislators took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States and to work towards improving and bettering the Union. Both, belonging to the Republican Party, have relinquished that very important duty. But what makes the crisis even worse is the fact that the constituents do not have the intelligence to understand that the politicians that they hired, that they elected to do the duty of the country, had long abandoned that task. George Washington warned us to guard against the imposture of pretended patriotism. We've heard it all. Donald Trump has claimed that he's going to make America great again. It's going to be about all America. Nobody else matters. Of course, a message that seems to resonate. But look at the outcome. Donald Trump has never been about America. But what makes the predicament even worse is the fact that those in the legislative branch whose task is to make certain that when we have an executive branch running amok, our country does not go in the brink of the precipice. Most unfortunately, that's exactly what we had, with both a Republican president and a Republican Congress and Senate. John F. Kennedy said that the ignorance of one voter in a democracy impairs the security of us all. Needless to debate that either. We've seen it happen. Voters went to the 2018 midterm election instead of getting rid of the very individual which have precipitated the country into the predicament it is today. Those same voters decided to keep those same individual. The question is now not whether the country is in a crisis, but rather how the rest of the constituent, those who are truly patriots, those who truly have the knowledge and the understanding as to what are they going to do to redeem the Republic. I'll be right back. I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The Fourth Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the Fourth Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Join me on our next social media broadcast. See you then. On the menu today, we have the two most important topics which we have been talking about: race relation in America, and we will continue with the conversation about slave trades, the rebellion. We will also take a look at the core values of the Republican Party, in the Republican Party, and which values are those and why those values are just now labels that have no meaning whatsoever in the Republican Party. As we begin the discussion on those topics, we will provide some scenarios in which we will try to demonstrate the importance of moving away from those predicaments in order to better the Union. Race relation in America is also a very important topic that had crippled to a large extent the progress in terms of race integration, in terms of diversity, in terms of culture in general. We will continue that debate and we will show who is behind fueling racism in America. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on Blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1. To bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2. To expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3. To extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. Then, and only then, will we, as a society, be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, "Racism is man's
gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason. Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. War on blacks. How do you solve racism in America? Impossible. Is it? How do you solve any problem at all? We learned that, one, you have to acknowledge that there is a problem. That's where you start. If this is not in the menu, it is impossible to solve any problem. Two, it must be understood what is causing, what are the roots of the problem. And three, there must be communication. In the case of racism in the country, all three of them are either lacking or completely discarded. And most importantly, the third aspect, the communication aspect, is completely non-existent. So, slavery officially ended well over a century. And yet, racism in America is widespread and rampant. That's number one in the menu. It must be acknowledged. Racism is not caused by a small group of people on the fringe, like the white nationalists or the white supremacists or the KKK. No, it is widespread in the United States of America. It must be understood, and of course, that's what we're here for, to explain as to the roots of this problem. But the third aspect actually can be looked at in collaboration with the second aspect that we are discussing at this point, meaning trying to find the roots of the problem, the beginning of the problem. Now, before we go there, remember today we're going to talk about a very specific aspect, the rebellions. Slavery was going on, and at some point they start getting a little bit more activities on that end, and the slaves start getting tired of the treatment, and rebellions began. Now, we must distinguish between just racism and institutionalized racism. There is absolutely nothing that I or anybody can do about the neighbor next door, the person you meet at the supermarket, on the train, or wherever. There is absolutely nothing you can do about any of those individuals if he or she is racist. But what we are more concerned about is institutionalized racism. Now, it is understood that yes, you cannot have institutionalized racism without racists. And most of those people that I just mentioned, the neighbor next door, the person you meet on the train, at the supermarket, at the workplace, they all contribute to create institutionalized racism. But for all purpose of our discussion, racism is separate from institutionalized racism. Now, racism is the behavior, it's the action, it's the thought that one individual has towards another individual based exclusively on the external, the physical factor. Meaning a white person doesn't like a black person just for that reason, because that white person doesn't like black people. That's just pure racism. Now, institutionalized racism is a system in place which nurture, condone, even promotes racist behavior, action, languages. Look at the President of the United States. In his words, his action, everything that he does promotes this type of behavior. That's how institutionalized racism works. Now, we gave a few examples in the past about member of the legislative branch that promotes on the bench judges who are racist. That to continue the prospect of institutionalized racism. It is a topic we will talk about in greater detail, but let's go back to our topic, slavery and the rebellion. Now, for all those people that for reason either out of ignorance or because they are racist, there is always an inclination, there is always a tendency to try to blame the victim. What I mean by that is I heard individuals who say, why didn't slaves try to escape? Why did they accept to be slaves for so long? And so on and so forth. So there are a number of arguments that are brought to the conversation. And if you follow the logic of those arguments very closely, it's like saying that they were slave, victim, now they're responsible for their problem. So it's like blaming the victim twice, that not only they were put in that predicament, now the individuals who are now in a position to look at it objectively didn't even bother, but just say that, well, that individual who was victim should have done something about it. It's the same concept that you used to hear about women who were raped, and the argument was, what was she wearing? So it's like blaming the victim twice. So it's kind of a very quick way for you to know who is racist, who is not, especially if you're talking to a white individual. You watch the argument, the logic behind the conversation. And that's, by the way, the reason conversation about racism and discrimination in America doesn't happen, because those who are racist, it's very easy for them to bring those type of argument because they come either from a lineage of racists, their great-great-grandfather was slave owners, slave masters, and those information, those kind of behavior were passed down from one generation to the other. So there is no other way to process those type of information but to put the blame on those who were victimized by the system that those white racists put in place. Now, we provided some important information about the type of treatment that white slave owners were inflicting on black slaves. Now, I'll take a step back to mention once again that when we're talking about race relation in America, we are very well aware of the fact that there are two very distinct groups of whites in the nation. There are whites who are racist and who discriminate. And there are whites who are not racist who do not discriminate. And because of that, it makes the conversation about race relation a very difficult conversation, because one cannot meet a white individual on the street and point finger and say that individual is racist. Nor can you say he or she is not racist. And the reason is because of what I just said. Now, in the past, it was more or less easier to put together or to identify areas of the country who that had more races. For instance, we know the South that's pretty much where most of the slavery happened. Then it is almost it wasn't difficult at all for you to know that if you stumble or if you meet an individual from the South at that time, then you didn't have to second guess yourself that that individual was either a slave owner or related to a slave owner and later on descendant of a slave owner. So this way it was easy to know where those white individuals or races where they came from, how they think. But because of migration throughout the country, now, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult, if it's not impossible, for anyone to be able to come to that conclusion. And that makes the conversation or even the discussion, even finding a solution, all the more difficult. Now, keep in mind, institutionalized racism is still active in America. Again, we give example, and we will come back to that as we continue the conversation, but we want to move from the slavery time and start moving and making our way towards today so that we can show you the progression as to why we are in the predicament we are today. Now, during slavery, slave owners, they mistreated, and by mistreated, even the word itself is not strong enough to explain the type of pain, the type of torture white slave owners inflicted on blacks. And they created all different ways to punish, to inflict pain, whether it's psychological pain, emotional pain, and physical pain. They try everything possible. They came up with everything possible, and they wanted to achieve two major goals. One, to force the slave to submission, and two, to instill fears on others so that they do not try to do anything that jeopardize slavery. Now, I think I may have shown you the picture of a former slave, Gordon, whose back was almost like a work of art, because how much he was beat until he bled, and before he even got healed, he got beat some more and got beat some more. And the way that slave owners took pleasure in beating slave is by pinning both hands on the ground, both feet on the ground, and with no shirt on their back, and they were just beating them until they bled. And after the beating, they had to go on the field to work. Those were the kind of treatment that black slave had to endure. Now, I have to quickly mention that all those slave owners, they dubbed themselves Christian. They went to church. They had great family that they took care of. They built wealth, houses, land, and so on. And at the same time that they were at church praying for I'm not sure what, but pretending to be Christian, and at home they have slaves that they were inflicting pain that even Jesus would have cried for those slaves. I may have mentioned to you before that some of those slave owners even cut lamb fingers, toes, in order to instill fears on not only the slave that did something wrong, but also on others if they tried. Starve them to death so that could teach them a lesson. Now, if you're torturing anyone, no matter who that person is, there is no way in the world you can expect that individual to be so good or so nice to you. And if that individual find an opportunity either to escape or to do you harm, then you can rest assured that individual will inflict the maximum harm on you, on your family, because that's what you've been doing to that individual for years, for decades even. In case you're not looking at where I'm going with that, rebellion. You chain an individual. First of all, you took them from their home country by force, get them here and enslave them, chain them, beat them, kill them, and they seen it happen. Brothers seeing their brother being shot down because one trying to escape, and there is absolutely nothing that individual who just witnessed his brother or gunned down or beat to death, there was absolutely nothing that individual could do, could not even take the time to mourn, because, well, unless he too wanted to be inflicted pain or even get killed. Those were the kind of predicament that whites put blacks on. Now, you imagine that scenario and picture that black individual, whether it's second, third, fourth generation, whose story here, who has been passed the story of what his great-great-grandfather or his great-grandfather, his grandfather or his father, who he may have even witnessed, how that person was executed like a dog, and he's that person who now had the opportunity to do something about it. And what exactly would you expect to happen? Come the rebellion. And rebellion could not possibly happen in the beginning of slavery, because first of all those slaves came from a different country. They don't know where they were at. They could hardly move from one end to the next and not get lost, because that wasn't their land. They had no idea where they were. So they spent generation after generation being slave, being mistreated, being killed, being starved to death by the whites. And you can expect that there would be a generation that will come forth, that will be looking at that predicament and understand that my father was an old man, could not do anything. My great-grandfather was an old man, could not fight the system. But as a young man, I want to make sure that is the end. Now, as mentioned before, there were small rebellion that happened, because no human being would ever cherish the idea of being enslaved. So yes, from time to time they try to push back, but they were treated with such atrocities that there was no strength left on those individuals to try to fight against the system. But as newer generation was being brought forth, now those new generation were two important things happen. They have the strength, they have the will, and they want their freedom. And on top of that, if some of them were lucky enough to have maybe their fathers or their mothers who could pass them certain pieces of information that they could use in order to go about doing whatever that they had in mind. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on Blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1. To bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2. To expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3. To extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. Then, and only then, will we, as a society, be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, "Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason." Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. Prior to more organized rebellion took place, there were several ad hoc rebellion. And because the slave owner were quick to squash them, then there was never any fear that any kind of attempt that the slave would make would succeed. But the white slave owners always live with the fear that if something like that were to happen, then they're not just worrying about their life. They weren't worrying necessarily about just losing the slave, because if you remember, the slaves were tools used by the white slave owners in order to increase their wealth, their stature, their financial position in the region. So it's getting rich on the back of slaves, on the back of black slaves, was what was in. Now, all those small little ad hoc rebellion did not go anywhere. But in 1800, now one thing you ought to understand that during the fight for the independence of the country of the United States of America, black slave that is, blacks fought side by side with white to push the English in order to give freedom to America. Yes, black slaves were called in to be part of the group of the resistance against Great Britain. So that was good for them too, because they learned a few things. They learn a few tricks. They watch. They understand the all the different ways that the leaders who were obviously leading the charge against Great Britain, the kind of strategy that those leaders use, and of course they learn. But again, as mentioned, those were individuals that maybe at that time, as time goes by, they obviously been worked up. They lost their strength. They were at the field for 18 hours a day. They were not fed properly. They were not clothed properly. They were not cared for properly. So they did not really have the strength to go against, to try to do any kind of well-structured rebellion. But as mentioned earlier, the new generation, the younger generation coming up, did see things the same way, and again they had the strength. Yes, they too were in the same boat as the older men, because they had to work the field for 18 hours a day. They were beat as much as the old individual, and they had to attend to the same type of treatment by the white slave owners. But as young men, they of course had the strength. Now in 1800, which I mentioned yesterday, a gentleman by the name of Gabriel Prosser. Now the last name for most slaves were last name of their masters, the slave owners. They would take the slave owner last name because most likely they would not care about a person's last name. So in order to identify a slave, then it was an easier way to identify those slaves to begin with, by making certain that they have the last name of the slave owner. But regardless, Gabriel Prosser was one of those type of individuals. So in 1800, Gabriel Prosser was born in 1775. So in 1800, he was just barely 24 years old. So he managed to get a number of people to hear his message that we have to have our freedom. So at 24 years old, he get the help of some people. According to history, he also had two other slaves, one by the name of Jack Bowler and the other one by the name of George Smith. They were helping him with the idea of escaping. Now, you have to understand one thing about the idea of rebellion for the slaves. When the slaves decided that they had enough of the treatment that they were being inflicted on, what they really had in mind was to escape. That was their ultimate plan, because they knew that the South, that's where slavery was taking place. The North was pretty much open to blacks. So blacks weren't a slave in the North, at least not to the extent it was in the South. So they know if they head north, they will be free, and they would not have to work 18 hours a day, and they would not be subjected to the kind of treatment that white slave owners subjected them to. So whenever you hear the term that there was rebellion, what really the slave was after was to just become free. And that was the irony of the whole thing, because as I mentioned, some of the slaves actually fought side by side with the whites who did not want to stay slave of Great Britain. The irony of the whole thing. They felt that they did not want any one individual to tell them, to dictate to them what to do, to dictate how they should live their lives. And yet, they did see the contradiction in fighting to end that, but to inflict the same treatment on blacks. That's the irony of the whole thing. So they wanted to free themselves from England, which happened, but they enslaved blacks. The same individuals who fought side by side with them to get rid of England, to get rid of the English army. Ironic, isn't it? But in any event, Gabriel Prosser did manage to round up a number of slaves who liked the idea of escaping slavery. They could have succeeded, but unfortunately, when at the time that was set for those individuals to actually decide to take it to escape, what ended up happening is there were two slaves who were too afraid of, actually, two things. Those slaves were afraid of two things. One, they were afraid that if Gabriel Prosser did not succeed, they could lose their lives. And on top of that, those two slaves were most household slaves, like maid type. So the bad treatment that they endured, the bad treatment that were inflicted on them were not as harsh as the treatment inflicted on those who worked on the field. So they did not have the same level, the same intensity for freedom as the slave who had to work 18 hours in the field under the scorching sun or the cold weather. So the incentive was not properly distributed among those who wanted to get out of slavery. And on top of that, as I mentioned before, there were slaves who still held hope that if they live long enough, they will be able to see their sibling, they will be able to see their grandchildren, they will be able to see their children, and so on and so forth. So those slaves, of course, it was false hope, but nevertheless, they felt a certain way, and that's human being, because they were stripped of someone who was dear to them. So they held hope that at some point, maybe they will be able to see those individuals. And because of that, there were two of such of those slaves who alerted the master about the plan. So, of course, the master alerted authority, and they were waiting for those individuals. Now, they could have still succeeded. They could have still succeeded, except for one small problem, that the night that Gabriel and his army, if we should call it that, this wanted to execute the plan, there was heavy rain, so the plan could not be executed. So they had to postpone the plan for the following night. And that was a big mistake on their part. Authority was already alerted. At that time, the governor of Virginia, James Monroe, had the opportunity to have a plan in place in order to counter the slaves who were trying to escape. They managed to do that. They captured some of them and killed some, but Gabriel managed to escape. Gabriel escaped and ended up in Norfolk, Virginia. But unfortunately for him also, when he ended up in Norfolk, Virginia, because words got out that they were looking for him again in Norfolk, it was other slaves who betrayed him because they wanted absolutely nothing to do with him because they heard about what had happened to those who tried to escape with him. They were killed and recaptured, and they suffered really even harsher treatment. And of course, they let authority in Norfolk know about Gabriel Prosser whereabouts. So they captured him, they tried him, and they hung him on October 6, 1800. He was just 25 years old. Now, that wasn't the end of rebellion, but that was the first major organized rebellion in the South that clearly sent a signal to white that blacks will no longer stand for the treatment that were being inflicted on them. Hi, I am MD, host of the Fourth Branch program. War on Blacks is a new topic added to the Fourth Branch programming in order to discuss the intricacies, the complexities of race relations in America. The goal is threefold. 1. To bring attention to the various forms of prejudice, discriminations, and racism in the country. 2. To expose the undeniable presence of such in every aspect of life and every corner of our society. 3. To extricate us all from the ignorance, the indifference, or the complicity. The ultimate objective is to make the discussions of those issues, racism, prejudice, discrimination, a normal part of our lives. Then, and only then, will we, as a society, be able to eradicate the problem. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." Abraham Joshua Heschel exclaimed, "Racism is man's gravest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for the minimum of reason." Join me in the journey to restore equality. Or would you please get out of the way? Thank you. Cicero, who is a Roman philosopher, lives in 63 BC, said that any man can make mistakes, but only an idiot will persist in his error. Any man can make mistakes, and any man has, every man has, but only an idiot persists in his error. Now, if the biggest threat to any democracy is ignorance. Ignorance cripples democracy. Ignorance is a very heavy burden on family members, and ignorance is useless to society. But for reasons that are beyond logic, Republican leaders, now I don't have any other way of qualifying those legislators, whether it's in Washington or at local state governors, mayors, and so on. So we'll continue to call them leaders. But the very definition of leaders, those individuals do not meet the definition of leaders. Because the very point of having a leader is to lead to better circumstances, to lead from a bad situation to a good situation. That's what a leader does. A leader looks at a situation, a predicament that's bad, and craft a way out of that bad predicament. But if you look at the past couple of years, no one can point to anyone in the Republican Party and say, there was a leader. Because you take any individual in the Republican Party the past 2 years, that individual has worked systematically, categorically to help take the country, plunge the country in further chaos that individual has helped helping the country out of the predicament. Now, you can spin it any which way you want. 2 + 2 are 4. No matter which language you speak, no matter what your race is, no matter what your predicament is, 2 + 2 are always going to be 4. The outcome we have today, no matter which way you spin your explanation around, you cannot have the outcome you have today if we had Republicans doing the job for which they were elected, at least the majority of them. Now, the reason that they could do that, not that I'm making any excuse for the legislators in Washington, it is not an excuse for them, but the reason that they were able to continue doing what actually jeopardizes our democracy and plunge our country further into chaos is because the Republican constituents are ignorant. I know, I heard it before. Republican constituents try as best as possible to tell me that I'm full of it, I don't know what I'm talking about, and so on and so forth. But when Republican legislators, just like the President of the United States, took an oath, the oath is to uphold the Constitution of the United States, not to protect the president, whoever is the president, to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Look in the mirror and tell me which of the Republicans did that during the past 2 years. Which of the Republicans decided that, you know what, the country is what ought to be protected, not Donald Trump, not a president. So yes, and as I mentioned to many of those individuals that seem not to like and that's why you see in the beginning of this program, we say, welcome to common sense. Because you can say whatever come to your mind, but logic, no matter which language you speak, no matter what your degree of your college degree is, if you cannot defy logic. If I say you are mortal because you're human, then you can have a PhD, then you would not be able to tell me that I'm wrong, because it is as simple as that. No matter what your level of intelligence, no matter what you think you know, that it's logical and that's what it is. You cannot change that. We are in the predicament we are today because the legislative body, which was fully controlled by the Republicans, decided not to uphold the Constitution of the United States. In fact, we have several different scenarios and proof that all the Republicans decided to completely bypass the Constitution, throw away the Constitution, and help the President of the United States to even trample rule of law. They actually help him in that process. Now, if the Republican constituents were not ignorant, the 2018 midterm election would have completely gotten rid of all those individuals. Because you would have said, at least we don't have politicians who are patriots, but we do have constituents who are. To those who try to explain away their behavior by keeping in Washington the very individual who have been acting in ways that are detrimental to the country, here's what I say. You cannot explain being smart by speaking like a fool and acting like an idiot. That cannot be. You cannot explain that you are a smart individual when your language is foolish and you're acting like an idiot. It's impossible. You cannot, write that down, it might become handy. You cannot explain being smart by speaking like a fool and acting like an idiot. Yes, the Republicans were in full control of both houses, the Congress and the Senate, and they all, not some, they all decided to do one thing and one thing: work against the country. They did not do anything that benefited the country. Look for yourself. What did they do that benefited the country? So it's not just someone who decides to speak, but we have the data in front of us. They can say, we passed a tax cut. Of course they did. 1.3 trillion out of the 1.5 went to large corporation and wealthy individual. And guess what? We, the people, fully responsible for every penny of those 1.5. We only got 0.2 of that. What did they do which benefit us? Now, don't get me wrong. The Democrats are not sane. There are plenty of things that Democrats have done that are not appropriate. Now, one can blame for policies and so on, because I heard that 1,000 times. You can blame Democrat. You don't like this policy. You don't like that policy. That is fine. That's what politics is supposed to be. I can give you a good example. For instance, we know that there is this divide between Democrat and Republican when it comes to, for instance, LGBT right. Now, you can debate that to death, that this is your position as a Republican and that is Democrat position as Democrat. That is fine. But when it comes to the country defending the United States of America, we expect legislators and the president to take the side of the United States. Now, the framers of the Constitution did foresee that there would be a time when we may have someone in the Oval Office who is not patriot, someone who doesn't care about the country, which we have today. But the framers never anticipated that we can have all the members of a political party completely relinquishing their duty, their task to protect the country, to helping the individual destroy our institution, destroy our freedom, destroy our democracy. The framers of the Constitution did not see that coming. So we have now a very big problem in the country. The flaws in our Constitution, they are so big and so bad that they need to be addressed, because the framers may have not seen that coming. Yes, they foresaw the possibility that a president could go wrong. That's why we have plenty of clauses in the Constitution that take care of that matter. But we don't have any way of addressing a political party who has full control of both houses and take care of that. Now, don't get me wrong. There is a way to do that, of course, at the ballot box. That can be taken care of at the ballot box. But when members of the legislative body decided to help the executive branch destroy our institution during that time, until an election came forth, there was absolutely nothing that anybody could do. As such, there is no provision to help rein in on the legislative body if it's fully controlled by a party, by a political party that decides either to do nothing or to collude with the executive branch. And that's what we had the past 2 years. That's why the country is in the predicament it is today. That's why you saw Donald Trump going after the media. You saw Donald Trump going out after the Justice Department, going after FBI, after CIA. All the institutions that make America the envy of the world, not only the executive branch tried to destroy them, but the legislative branch also just gave the help. Devin Nunes was the chairman of the Intelligence Committee in Congress was found to be plotting against the Department of Justice. And we have example after example that, yes, the legislative body, there was no control at all to help rein in on the legislative body that was helping the executive branch destroy the very fabric of the United States of America. And what made it even worse is the fact that the 2018 midterm election came. Yes, there were some of those Republicans who lost their seats. But what Democrats call a blue wave, I call it a joke. Because look how many members in the Republican Party got reelected back to Washington. Join me here on the 4th branch at 10:30 a.m. every Saturday. And every weekday at 2 p.m. This is the 4th branch.
Common sense in a world of chaos.
This program will resume in just a moment.
I do thank you for spending the time with me. I hope it was useful. And we hope you can join us again tomorrow at 2 p.m. when we resume the conversation on race relation in America. And we will continue the conversation about the rebellion, the slave trade and the rebellion, in which we will show you the progress that the slaves were making in terms of helping drive slavery out of the country. If you have, in the meantime, if you have any question, comment, suggestion, criticism, please do not hesitate to contact us. And if you so happen to have a topic you would like us to research and talk about, do send us a line and let us know how we're doing. Contact us so that we can bring to you topics of importance, no matter what the subject is, social, political. We will research it, we will address it here. Our objective, once again, is to better the union. We do not have any political agenda. We hope you can help us, join us. You can become part of the solution. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. I am MD, host of the 4th branch program, inviting you to join me every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. and every weekday at 2 p.m. for discussions of social, political issues and to dissect the meaning and the importance of current events, as well as to understand topics of legislations. The 4th Branch Project is not associated with any political party, and we at the 4th Branch do not have any political agenda or aspiration. Our ultimate objective is to work towards achieving a more perfect union by removing ignorance, the biggest obstacle to our democracy. Join me on our next social media broadcast. See you then.
The Fourth Branch podcast is brought to you in collaboration with the People Branch publication, which can be found on the People Branch website, located at peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org. That's peoplebranch.org website, in which you will find a number of very interesting articles. My name is Mike Duchesne, MD for short. I hope you have a great afternoon or a great evening, whichever it happens to be. Hopefully you can join me again next time for another interesting episode of this podcast. That was the Fourth Branch, live from New York. Good day.